So, the end of the line for one of the biggest names in African politics, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, for so long seen as a liberator, a scholar and a gentleman, a hero of the developing world and a leader among the non-aligned nations, a champion of the underdog who led Zimbabwe onto the path of independence. Journalist Tichona Zindoga, the political editor of the Herald in Harare, is one of millions of young Zimbabweans who grew up with Mugabe.
I can remember one incident in 1990 or so. He came to our area in Seke, must be, with these helicopters screaming, and people were screaming and shouting, and they had actually spent hours waiting for him. And when he did arrive, there was this pandemonium of people wanting to catch a glimpse of him, and that was like very standard during that time. And also, if we're in the towns, the motorcade will be passing. The speed is just too much, but people will be waiting there, waving, and possibly everybody hoping that he's seeing me, saying hi there. That's just the kind of love people had for President Mugabe.
He became an international statesman, respected around the world. Through resources and agriculture, the economy ticked over nicely. There was education for all, and soon Zimbabwe was to boast one of Africa's highest literacy rates.
The quintessential African hero was Robert Mugabe. He was synonymous with the party. Some people almost thought he single-handedly, took independence, took us to independence. That was the narrative, and there was a lot of credit also to go with that. He sacrificed a lot for the country. Spent 11 years in jail. Oversaw the political and the military leadership of the liberation movement. He oversaw the negotiations at Lancaster and everything. And as you might recall, 1980 was big in terms of the elections and what came out of it. So growing up in Zimbabwe, Mugabe was the man. And that stature he maintained, across the country, almost without distinction.
The other side of the Mugabe coin was not so bright. Tens of thousands of people killed in Matabeleland in his first years in power, a brutal crackdown on dissent, a once thriving economy left in ruins, without a currency and with little hope.
After the euphoria of the independence, the first 10 years, which were pretty fair economically, we now have the experiments with the ESAP and everything, the structural adjustment program, that did cause a lot of suffering, and dislocation from a socio-economic perspective. And we can see a growing dissent, from there. People are not happy, losing their jobs, social services going down, the schools, the hospitals are having their standards lowered, So people from 1992, 93, 94, people are unhappy, and that is how we see even the rising discontent with the labor movement.
It is one of the longest stories in African politics that began nearly a century ago. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born near Kutama Mission in rural southern Rhodesia in 1924. The bookish youth graduated from Fort Hare in South Africa in 1951 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. He trained as a teacher in what is now Zambia. In 1958 came the teaching job that changed his life. He went to Ghana and saw newly independent black Africans walking tall. It led him to liberation politics, and in 1960 he joined ZAPU with Joshua Nkomo. In 1961 he married Sally Hayfron, whom he met in Ghana. She died in 1992. In 1963 ZANU was formed, and this political activism led to prison in 1964. Mugabe served 10 years and studied law. In 1974, the authorities released him and he fled to Mozambique to join the armed struggle. At independence in 1980, he was elected to lead Zimbabwe as its prime minister. In 1987, he became president. 9 years later, he married former typist Grace Marufu at Kutama Mission, near his birthplace. In 2013, he won his 7th term in office with 61% of votes in a disputed election. In 2017, the military takeover of Harare signalled the beginning of the end. Years after his first wife Sally died in 1992, to the surprise of many, in 1996, Mugabe married again to Grace Marufu, a former secretary at State House and more than 40 years his junior. She bore him 3 children, Robert Jr., Borna and Bellarmine. Later, she and her children were to draw much condemnation for their conspicuous love of the good life.
People grew to be unhappy with her in terms of the shopping sprees, which were perceived or otherwise, because you also realize that in terms of the opposition, there were people trying to go at Mugabe at his weakest point, and the weakest point would be to attack his wife or to cast aspersions at the wife. But as a young woman, herself, and I'm sure having grown some tastes, and being exposed, to the wealth and the allowances and all that comes with the office of the emoluments that come with the office of the president. She was exposed to, to various capitals of the world where she would inevitably shop. But this now happening in an era and in a country where standards of living were going down, and people do not exactly afford the kind of lifestyle she would flaunt, she was bound to be an object of hate. And we can see that as things got harder in Zimbabwe, the more, the angrier the people got with her, which quite reminds us of Queen Mary Antoinette, and even for convenience sake, the opposition would conjure up that kind of image, possibly unfair on her part, but this is what evolved. This is how the situation evolved.
In 1997, the economy started to unravel as the Zimbabwean government started writing checks it couldn't cash. It had to fund an expensive war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, costing up to $1 million a day, and promises of compensation to the restless ranks of the war veterans. Production of cash crops like tobacco collapsed, leaving the world-famous trading floor in Harare with more space than leaves. It led to a run on the Zimbabwe dollar and to the first worrying signs of economic collapse. For the best part of 2 decades, Mugabe just held on and his supporters kept celebrating regardless. He won 7 terms, albeit with the help of dubious elections.
He was there due to his control of the state apparatus or the coercive machinery of state. But the problem is, or the situation rather, is deeper than that. It is more sociological. You can also talk of the political conditioning of Zimbabweans. Here is a man who was very populist, who actually did a lot of things, for the ordinary people, in terms of the rural populace. He gave them land, and even when they had not been that land reform, he would support, farmers, rural farmers, and the peasants with grain, in terms of the seed, or in terms of want, he would pitch in and give relief to the people. And he is also somebody who is not a bad character. You talk to him today, he would convince you, and I'm sure there are so many people who would have loved to hate him, but who eventually liked him when they got, a tete-a-tete with him. And we even speak about his political demagoguery. People were taken in by that because he's an eloquent speaker. He convinces, he convinces people, and in an era where we have not outgrown the spectre of colonialism, near-colonialism, and we see the interests of the West in Zimbabwe. Those things did really appeal to Zimbabwe, and you would find that even at the worst of times, people are suffering economically, but they have a political hope, they have a political Bible to refer to, and the seer of that church is Robert Mugabe, and that is why they are following him.
But the years were taking their toll, and the elder statesman was getting tired. Age was eating away at his once famed eloquence.
If you go into a process and join in a competition where there are only two outcomes, win or lose, you can't be both. You either win or you lose. If you lose, then you must surrender to those who have won. If you win, those who have lost must also surrender to you. And this is it.
Then, in the early hours of November the 15th, 2017, came the denouement. The military moved in. The roots of this military action in Harare lie in Zimbabwe's protracted power struggle over who should take over from 93-year-old President Robert Mugabe, who's been in power for more than 37 years. There were two heirs to the throne, Zanu-PF veteran politician and Deputy President Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the 51-year-old wife of the president, Grace Mugabe. She is supported by the so-called G40 group of young Zanu-PF members. When Mnangagwa was fired, the head of the army, Constantine Chiwenga, moved in support of him. This could make 75-year-old Mnangagwa the favourite to take over as interim president at the very least. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, president, statesman, former guerrilla leader and African nationalist. Those who knew him will never forget his presence and his drive. Those who opposed him will rue his often vindictive ruthlessness. He freed his country from the yoke of colonialism and at the very least leaves behind a nation with yet some hope of recovery. Chris Bishop for CNBC Africa.